computer. I think you all heard that. All right, so I'm going to start the show. Rest in peace. And this is Cemeteries in St. Louis. And I'm Doug Schneider. And we're going to start with burial mounds. These are, of course, mounds that were here before St. Louis was a city. We had a mound called Big Mound. And this is a photograph of Big Mound actually when it was being systematically destroyed. It was a huge Indian mound, 300 feet long, 150 feet wide, and it was a landmark for steamboat pilots on the Mississippi River, this big mound. Now this picture, you'll notice the mound is now smaller, and here it's getting smaller, and finally it was just all taken away. It was all taken away, even though there was a burial chamber, 20 to 30 individuals. Of course, back then, the early 1800s, people really didn't care too much about artifacts from Indian civilization, Native American civilization and stuff. So that big mound that you saw is now represented by this large rock, and that is on the riverfront, of course, and you can see that's the bridge over to Illinois, the interstate bridge. Now, so that big rock is all that remains of the big mound. But Sugarloaf Mound there's still part of this mound. There's half of this mound still here on this side of the river. And it was built by the Osage, as the big mound was. Before they built the arch, we built the mounds. That's what the Osage say, right there. And there were once 40 mounds on this side of the Mississippi, and only half a mound remains. And the Osage came back here and purchased it in 2009. And there it is. That's half a mound. As you can see, the other half a mound just got chopped out for this house to be built. So those are burial mounds. Then we have the becoming of the colonial city, and we have burial grounds. Okay. And I'm going to look at a couple of these. Faith Presbyterian Church. This is an old church in Des Peres. The stone church you see there. The giraffe you see on the left is not from colonial times. And the old burying ground is marked here in this church from and it says, here are buried the early settlers, the founders of the church who came here from these eastern states in 1815. And you can see a few of the tombstones still there from the old burying ground. But besides settlers, there are slaves that were buried here, and their graves weren't marked, or if they were marked with wood. Of course, that wood isn't around anymore, so they have a little memorial over on that side. Well, I'm going to sometimes tell you about famous people buried in places, and for this Presbyterian burying ground is this guy, George Sisler, and he would be known by fans of St. Louis baseball history. He was the first baseman for the St. Louis Browns, and he was the manager in the 1920s. He's buried there in Des Peres. The First Baptist Church of Chesterfield, this is their burial ground. Notice that the entrance to these old burial grounds are very modest, just some sort of post there. This burial ground is kind of special. It's a burial ground for African Americans, and African Americans at that time worshipped with their owners, and this is a burial ground for the church. And one person in the congregation decided that the slaves should have their own burial ground. Her name was Marie Long, and she designated this plot of land to the slaves. It was also to be a church and a cemetery. The church has moved away to a much bigger quarters, but it was right next to the cemetery. Of course, the cemetery has stayed. So this is the inside of the First Presbyterian Church of Chesterfield's burial ground. And this cemetery is full. it is full. There is no empty spot. Well, you look at a lot of empty ground here, but in this case, it all goes back to wooden markers. Most of those markers have just simply disintegrated. So, but there are a few actual tombstones. This tombstone here has this, the two hands clasped. That is a traditional 19th century image, the eternal bond between the living and the dead. This here is another stone. I liked it because it said mother. It was very clear as you're standing there that it was put there by the family. So that was a church burial ground. But now we're going to look at family cemeteries. There are over 100 of them in St. Louis. And we'll go with the Bates Family Cemetery in Chesterfield because Mr. Bates, who was a governor, actually comes back to the cemetery once a year and you can talk to him. Yes, it's kind of nice. He comes back from the grave. Here's his house. It's Thornhill. It's in Faust Park. And the burial plot is behind the house. And it is now fenced in with this wooden fence. And the reason it's fenced in is that deer were rubbing their antlers against these grave markers and knocking them over. So they had to fence the area in. Here you can see a couple things. The first is headstones, which are on the right, tall, and footstones on the left, which are small, marking a grave. And if you look hard, you can see that this grave here in the picture is Governor Frederick Bates. He was the second governor of the state, and that is his grave. He comes back on October 31st to greet people, and you can talk and chat with him. It's nice of him to come back from the grave. So you also saw that there were footstones. It's like a burial line for where that person is buried. And they are small. You saw the headstones were big. And it's like a frame, a headboard and footboard. There's another view of the Bates Family Cemetery. Buried here, of course, is the second governor of Missouri, Bates. The Belle Country Club, which is in Town and Country, they have a family cemetery. They sort of inherited it. They're an active country club at the PGA Championship there in 2018. But on the seventh hole, they have a family cemetery. Here it is. It's a little decrepit, but it's the Hibbler and Fitzgerald Family Cemetery. It goes back to 1845. And the country club just takes care of the cemetery. It's there, and they marked it off with little stones, mark the boundary, and they just take care of it. There you can see the little stones around it. There's the seventh hole. There's the logo for Belle Reve. And this is one of the organizers or one of the administrators at Belle Reve. You can see the graveyard from the greens, and it's just part of their landscape. Well, the Burns-Stewart Family Cemetery is in full view, except you've driven by it many times, not noticing it because you wanted to keep your eye on the road, at least on Interstate 44. As I mentioned, there's over 100 family cemeteries in the St. Louis area. So here's Interstate 44 west about Eureka, and it's near Route 66 State Park. Before you get to Route 66 State Park, you see that little sign there. That's a family cemetery. And it's a family cemetery for the Burns and Stewart families, nice Scottish families. Here's the road up to the cemetery. And here is a Stewart tombstone. There's a little info on the family cemetery. What I'd like you to really notice is that it is a non-profit. Most of these family cemeteries are non-profits. And we're going to go to the Taylor Family Cemetery. That's out in Defiance. That is a family cemetery of people who are related to President Zachary Taylor. The president is not buried there, but these are people who are related. And it's out in Defiance, Missouri. There's Zachary. And it's run by a nonprofit organization. First burial was 1838. Okay. And unfortunately, recently, some headstones were stolen. And I don't know, I can't figure out what people would want to do with headstones, but there's a little sign that didn't get stolen, but headstones were stolen. And as I mentioned, it's a nonprofit. And one of the people who's administrating this family cemetery is actually listening to this talk. And I'm going to ask him at the end of the talk if he might tell us a bit more about family cemeteries after we go through all the different types of cemeteries we have. And I don't have him on my screen, but I assume he's nodding his head yes. And that is Lee Cox. So anyway, we now have a question. And been talking about cemeteries in Defiance, Town and Country, Chesterfield, De Pere, and Eureka. The question is, why no burial grounds in the city? What I've been talking about, they're all outside the city. And the reason is all the ones in the city have been closed and the bodies have been moved elsewhere, generally, at least in the old city. Bodies moved elsewhere for two reasons. The first reason is health. And it's believed that miasma, which is a poisonous gas, emanates from cemeteries, causes yellow fever and cholera. At least that was an old belief, but it was a strong enough belief to move the cemeteries out of the city limits. And actually in 1823, no more burials in the city limits. The other reason that the burial grounds were closed inside the city is real estate, because city property became very profitable. And again, old cemeteries all disappeared. We do have a few still within the city limits, but generally there was a big movement to move bodies out of the city. And here we have somebody basically crushing a cemetery to get rid of it, so to speak. And here is some graves that were where the coffins were dug up. Now, those graves were Chinese people. This burial ground was being dug up and bodies were being moved. And the Chinese people, at least in that generation in the 19th century, had their bodies shipped to China. They wanted to be buried in their hometowns, but only the people who could afford it could ship their coffin, their bodies in their coffins to China. So these burials are the poor Chinese who couldn't afford that, and the city, which dug up all their graves, sent them back to China. So they got their traditional wishes, and they did get to China somehow. Anyway, these old cemeteries, they cleaned them out, they moved the bodies, but they missed some coffins at some point. And how do we know this? We'll get a Burger King. The Burger King was being destroyed, being demolished, or no, was being built. It was being built here, and they discovered some coffins while they were building or excavating for the Burger King. Well, we have the year 1855 in St. Louis. We don't have a botanical garden. We don't have an art museum. We don't have Forest Park. What did we have? Well, we're going to go, we had cemeteries for the living. Cemeteries for the living. And here is cemeteries for the dead. Just a whole bunch of gravestones next to a church. They're all just packed together. But in Massachusetts, something was happening in the 1850s. Mount Auburn was coming into existence. It's in Watertown, Massachusetts. And this is what it looked like. Not the picture you saw before, the drawing you saw before, with just a whole bunch of gravestones next to a church. This is something different. This is a botanical garden, an art museum, and a park, all rolled into one cemetery. So this was groundbreaking and inspirational and inspired other places. It was called the Rural Cemetery Movement, and they had winding roads and picturesque vistas. And the idea was you enter the cemetery and you're outside the everyday world. You're taken out of the everyday world. And you can come in contact with spirituality. You can concentrate, you can meditate. It's a whole different field from that plot of land next to a church, jam-packed with gravestones, a rural cemetery. And the first rural cemeteries in St. Louis, Bellefontaine and Calvary. But I'm going to look at one made a little bit later, 1910, Mount Hope Cemetery. It's in LeMay. There's a nice little bird enjoying the time in Mount Hope. And what you'll notice in this cemetery, to really show you that you are leaving the ordinary world behind, there is a monumental entrance gate. And there it is. So this is telling you you're leaving the everyday world with all its troubles, and you're coming to someplace tranquil where you can meditate. And nice and grassy, old trees there, creek, very, very picturesque, natural beauty, and that respects the people who are buried there. And here's a long view of a nice winding road at Mount Hope, and there are the gravestones there. And this landscape was created by Edmund Kinsey. Edmund Kinsey spent his life as an architectural landscaper, and he built over $110 million of public works for the city, including Mount Hope and including the World's Fair. He designed all those lagoons and roads and bridges, the World's Fair. And here, this is 6 years after the World's Fair, he designed Mount Hope. And in Mount Hope, there are a large number of Serbian graves. And one thing about Serbia, I've been to Serbia, and I have passed by graveyards in Serbia, and I noticed that they have photographs on their headstones, and the ones in Mount Hope also have photographs, just like the gravestones in Serbia. And at some graves actually have Cyrillic alphabet for the name of the person who is buried there. So that's kind of special there in Mount Hope. Now, what Mount Hope also has is a mausoleum. And a mausoleum is an alternative to you being buried in dirt. If you're looking for just a nice, clean, pleasant place to be buried, you'd be buried in a mausoleum, which is a building. You'd be buried inside a building. And the first mausoleum in the world was actually one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum of King Massaslaus at Halicarnassus. And what you'll see, this is a sketch. Of course, we don't really know what it looked like, but we know there were 4 parts to this first mausoleum. A base, which was rectangular, then a temple, and then a ziggurat. And a ziggurat is a step pyramid rather than a smooth side pyramid. It's just those steps. And to cap it off, there is a sculpture at the top. Now, this may be a little familiar to you, this shaped monument, because we have this building in St. Louis, the same, and it's actually a tribute to the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. How do we know it's a tribute? Because of the 4 features. There is the rectangular base, though it's pretty large, pretty tall. There is the temple on top of the base, and there is the ziggurat, and up on top is the sculpture. And that sculpture looks like this. And many people look up there and they think they see a sphinx. Well, we all know a sphinx has the body of a lion, but this creature up on top has the body of a lion, yes, but the wings of an eagle. So it's the body of a lion plus the wings of the eagle, and that equals not a sphinx, but a griffin. And a griffin is the most powerful of all mythological creatures because it, it has the strength of a lion and the power of an eagle. And you'll see a face there. It's a human face, not a mythological creature face. And that is the face of Louis IX, who is St. Louis. All right. So mausoleum, at least at Mount Hope, dignified alternative to ground burial, beautiful place to visit and remember your loved ones, and of course, not get rained on if you're inside the mausoleum. So here's Mount Hope's mausoleum exterior. Here's the interior, and you can see where people are buried inside the mausoleum. They're buried also on the outside of the mausoleum, but just a very calm, reflective place. Here's the outside. And again, the same places where the people are buried. Right. So we went from rural cemetery. We now want to going to look at fraternal cemeteries. These are groups of clubs. We'll just say clubs in life, lots of members, and they create their own cemeteries. And we'll look at the Elks. I think we're all familiar with the Elks. This is a sketch of Elks Rest. That's at Bellefontaine. And here are some people standing in this area, this plot of land in Bellefontaine. And the organization purchased this plot of land in 1883. They've got 33 people buried there. And this is the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks. And here is their emblem. And they've updated that emblem, and their motto is now Elks Care and Elks Share. And buried here in this plot, of course, would be somebody who was an elk. That's John Cockerell. And I found this interesting in that he was called one of the 3 handsomest men in New York City. All right. He was a reporter for a New York newspaper at the time. Connecticut newspaper called him one of the 3 handsomest men in New York City. And of course, we want to see his photo. There he is. Well, he went on to report the Russo-Turkish War, which was a big deal. And that got him noticed by the Post-Dispatch. So John Cockerell got a job with the Post-Dispatch, and he was an active elk, and he donated that sculpture that you saw in the picture there. Here, this is the sculpture of the elk. Actually, quite a handsome elk. We'll notice down here the logo, Brotherly Love. That's because the Elks are a fraternal organization. Well, another fraternal organization, the Harugari Friedhof, it's in Manchester. Friedhof is the German word for cemetery. So we call it the place of peace. And established in 1877 by the Einigkeits Lodge of the Order of the Harugari Society to preserve and promote the German language and culture back in the 1900s. And here's the entrance. This is a new gate put up by the city of Manchester because Manchester couldn't find anybody left over from this organization. The organization has disappeared from St. Louis. So the city of Manchester maintains it, put up that new gate, and just keeps it clear. And you can see the cemetery is very close to houses. Now, burial. Yes, many people want to be buried, but many people, becoming more popular, want to be cremated. And There's the Missouri Crematory. Here's a picture of it. This is the first crematory west of the Mississippi River. If you died in Missouri before this was built and you wanted to be cremated, they put your body on a train to Pennsylvania. You were cremated there and your ashes were returned. And ashes are the old-fashioned word. Cremains are the new-fashioned word for what's left after cremation. So, and actually, this building does not do cremations any longer. So this is just somebody closing the door. The what do we call this? Oh, the retort, where the bodies are cremated. It's not in use any longer. My uncle was cremated and in a cemetery on Long Island, and you actually were, if you were attending the funeral, you went into like an auditorium. And the auditorium, they had my uncle's coffin on rollers, and they opened the retort door and they rolled the coffin into the flames, So you definitely knew that Uncle Joe was cremated. And in the crematory, these boxes, unclaimed remains. They still have them there. I guess people may still be picking them up. Who knows? Well, who got cremated here? A personality in Missouri history, Frank James. I hope you all know the name of his brother. It was Jesse. And Frank James got his own movie. He had an own life outside of when he was no longer was in the James gang with Jesse. Frank James was cremated here, and this was still the only crematory west of Mississippi. 1915, he got cremated here. There's Jesse and there's Frank, and here's Jesse E. James. He was signing in his uncle's body to be cremated. So it's the son of Jesse James, Frank James' nephew. Frank James, by this time, he worked in a movie theater in St. Louis, and that was part of it. Part of the gig is that the movie theater said, "You will be shown to your seat by Frank James to get to sell more tickets there." Well, we're now going to move from a crematory to a columbarium. Crematory creates cremains. A columbarium stores cremains. This one's called Hillcrest Abbey. It's right next to the crematory, and it has niches for funeral urns to be stored. Here's the picture of the front of the building. Here's the inside of the building. You can see the little storage areas there. Trinity Episcopal Church. Prime timers will be familiar with this church because we used to hold meetings in this church, and has had a major role in gay history in the city of St. Louis. And they have ashes buried in the church lawn. Whoop, shouldn't say ashes. Cremains are buried in the church lawn, unmarked, but the names of the deceased are inscribed on the wall. So here is an overview at Trinity, and you can see the grassy area where the cremains are spread, but you can also see on the wall where the names of the people whose ashes are in the ground, or the cremains are in the ground are. So that's the listing there. Not the location, just the names. The locations are basically unknown unless you were there at the time that the cremains were put in the ground. Well, my uncle went into the flames, but you can now be cremated without flames. And that's through alkaline hydroxide or hydrolysis, alkaline hydrolysis. Valhalla Cemetery up in Belnar with magnificent, impressive entrance here or building here. and that's their mausoleum, which has a statue from the World's Fair, boy with a mandolin. There he is inside the mausoleum there. Here are people on the staff of the cemetery at a funeral where the horse and buggy is going to carry the coffin. And they do flameless cremation at this cemetery. It's warm water, potassium hydroxide, 12 hours to completely cremate. The bones are left, then the bones are processed and returned to the family. So Valhalla Cemetery, which you just saw a few pictures of, they put on a show called Voices of Valhalla, where they had actors dress up as the people in the graves and to give a little history of the people in the graves. So here is October 2018. You can see this guy is reenacting whoever is in that grave. And it's being done by the Hawthorne Players of Florissant. They have since moved to Bellefontaine, but the Hawthorne Players are still the same group, and they do stories not necessarily of famous people, but just stories of people, ordinary people who might have done extraordinary things. So now they're at Bellefontaine. This is after 2018. And these are the reenactors that are reenacting someone in a grave. And of course, your eyes are drawn immediately to this guy here. So let's look at him, because he's reenacting someone buried in Bellefontaine. That person was Conrad Freibertheiser, who was lived in the 19th century, and he was from Switzerland. He moved his family to the United States, and they were bell ringers, which is a form of a musical group in Switzerland. He formed a similar group here, and they toured with P.T. Barnum, going around. That's why he has that interesting costume on, because you have to look interesting if you're going to tour with P.T. Barnum. And here's a Swiss-made bell. And he retired from show business, and he moved to St. Louis, and that's how he became buried in Bellefontaine. Well, let's see. You can get cremated, you can get buried, you can get mummified. Yes, that has actually happened. Uncle Joe Marcotte, he is here in this little tomb, mummified. His mummy is in there. Yes, don't believe me? There he is. There he is. And he has been mummified, formaldehyde. This is Mount Olive Cemetery, which is a Catholic cemetery. So he is open. You can go visit him on Catholic holidays, also on his birthday. And he left behind, he was a pretty stingy man. He didn't like children. He lived sort of a solitary life. But he left behind a bank account to maintain things in case, like, his clothes got rotted and they needed to be changed and so forth. They haven't used much of that money. Who hasn't used it? This guy in the center, that is Joe's great-great-grandnephew. He maintains this tomb and whatever needs to happen with his great-great-grand uncle. He also has access to that bank account. So you can go visit him. His, let's see, it's May 8th, 2024, Uncle Joe, that's the 100th anniversary of his mummification. So that will be a big deal. Living headstones, this is something new. Not those old tired headstones with this on it, the QR code. And the QR code's linked to a website where you can read all about the life of the deceased, so that person comes to life that way. And here's someone using their phone to look at the QR code. Here's another QR code on a flat gravestone. Well, you can get buried, you can get put in a mausoleum, you can get cremated with fire, without fire, mummified, if you're up to it. But many people choose to donate their body to science. Or I should say, many people choose to gift their body to science. It depends who you're donating or gifting to. If you're donating to Washington University, they use donate. And if you're gifting to St. Louis University, it's gifting. In both cases, your body is going to be dissected by college students. We're going to learn about the body. So here are some college students, process of dissecting. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of students, a whole bunch of cadavers, a whole bunch of going on, a whole bunch of talking, a whole bunch of who knows what. So what happens at the end of the session when the cadavers are dissected in the medical school? They find all the pieces. Oh, here we go. Notice the guy on the left. He doesn't like the camera because he thinks he's doing something that he doesn't want recorded. The end of all this dissecting going on, you can't keep track of whose liver this was. It's over here on this table. So all the body parts are collected and they're all cremated together. All cremated together. So obviously, they're not going to get given back to the family because you might get someone else's ashes from someone else's liver. So what happens is, if you're dissected at Washington University, they have a memorial grove out at Tyson, out near Eureka, and this is where the cremains are scattered. Again, you don't know whose liver is what, whose ashes are what. They're all mixed together. And that was the statement is this memorial was erected in remembrance of those who have supported medical education in the body donor program. Yes. And there's a little place where people can come who know that their relatives are spread somewhere. They don't know where, somewhere in this park created by Washington University. And they can come and they can reflect, but they can't point to a spot and say that their aunt is in this particular spot. And so WashU has made sure that this park is ecologically resilient, native plants that are attractive and seasonal. Here's another area where you can just sit and contemplate. Well, if you donated your body or gifted your body at SLU, it's at St. Peter's and Paul. It's a little more formal entrance here. And it's a multi-purpose cemetery. Here is the area where the gifted body ashes or cremains are spread. As you can see, not marked, but there are benches there to create a contemplative mode. But there is a memorial and some names. And this memorial says, sacred to the memory of the generous who gave their bodies to science. And this here is actually on the St. Louis University campus. We express appreciation to body donors and their families that made this precious gift. Well, cemeteries have dead people, so you wouldn't be surprised that cemeteries can be haunted. And we're going to look at one cemetery that is not marked on the map. It's not marked on the map. It's down there by the river where 255 crosses the river. It's not marked and it's large. It's large. Look at it right there. No name. No name. But this cemetery has 18,000 people in it. It's not a park. It's a former quarantine hospital. And that hospital had a cemetery. And at night, apparitions of the patients in hospital gowns will wander the area. Why? Because they were put in mass graves. How did this come about? You can also hear moans and screams from these former patients in that area there, unmarked area. This was the Robert Koch or Cook, I'm not sure, the hospital. And cholera was rampant in New Orleans, also rampant here in St. Louis. And steamboats were coming up the river, and we didn't want people with cholera getting off the steamboats in St. Louis. So they got off the steamboats in Oakville, and the passengers were tested and checked. And if they had cholera, they had to be treated at this hospital. And the site grew. 19 buildings, a post office, a farm, a railroad stop, houses, recreational facilities, a big deal. And postcards. There are postcards of this hospital. But the only physical thing that's left is this water tower, eerily looking like a witch's hat on top. 18,000 patients buried here, many of them in mass graves, and all of it unmarked. Well, talk about Henry Clay. You probably heard his name in some history class. He had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, right? He was a senator from Kentucky. He was Secretary of State. He ran for president. He was Speaker of the House. There he is. He was noted for oratory, Speaker of the House, and he had a farm. He had a farm in St. Louis, in North St. Louis. And part of that farm never got farmed. And we have untouched tall grass prairie within the St. Louis city limits, or at least St. Louis County. Yes, we'll make it St. Louis County. So here is that untouched prairie. So part of the farm was never tilled. What about the rest of that farm? That farm became the largest cemetery in Missouri. Okay, you're all muted, but you can guess what is the largest cemetery in Missouri. Begins with a C, Calvary. Okay. And Calvary is got some incredible grave monuments. It's one of the Weeping Angel. So established as a Catholic cemetery, established in 1854. 1/3 people are buried there in Calvary. And this was the caretaker's house. And notice all those girls on the steps there. At this point, it's no longer a caretaker's house. It was an orphanage. Buried here at Calvary, well, Alfonso Palazzolo. He was a gang leader. He was a gangster. So he's going to get a gangster's burial. With this Italian, this background, European background, he gets a photograph on his tombstone. There's a close-up of him, obviously in his younger days. And here is the Campobello band that came to his burial service, And there's a view of the burial service there. Also buried, somebody was not a gangster, people were not gangsters. These were 4 Nez Perce Indians, and they came on foot, 1831, from what would become Idaho. They walked here from Idaho, the 4 of them. And they came here because William Clark was here, the great father. And Clark was the superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time. But he had a connection to the Nez Perce. There's William Clark. And his connection, Lewis and Clark, they lived with the Nez Perce for a month during the winter when they were on their way back from the Pacific Northwest. They lived there with them for a month. And at that time, Clark could speak to the Nez Perce. He had a grasp of their language. But now, this from 1806, we're up to 1830 something. Clark has long ago forgotten how to say anything in the Nez Perce language. So these people, these four of them, two of them died while they were here. They were supposedly looking for the Great Book. They said they were looking for the Great Book. We assume, or people assumed, that they were talking about the Bible. But in any event, two of them died here, and that the monument is in Calvary Cemetery. Those two were baptized as Catholics, so that's why they get a monument. One died on the journey back to Idaho, and one we don't know what happened to him. But because they came here, this told missionaries that the Pacific Northwest was going to become an active spot, and what this inspired many missionaries to go west. Also buried here, Dred Scott. And there is his stone. There's a former stone, actually, and it has been redone, and it's now snazzy. Let's go back. Let's go back. Did you see here, the bottom? That is a cenotaph. The cenotaph marks someone who is buried elsewhere. And the person who is buried elsewhere next to Dred Scott would be, of course, Harriet Scott. She's buried elsewhere. So anyway, Dred Scott has this new snazzy monument. But there is the cenotaph that was next to him. Here is a statue of Dred and Harriet in front of the old courthouse. And Harriet is in an African-American cemetery called Greenwood. It's in Hillsdale. And the Greenwood isn't all that well kept up, but it is a site on the National Underground Railroad network, and it's getting more attention. You can see somebody help cleaning it up. Be a volunteer. These are the two people in charge of the cemetery, and you can see the gravestone there. That gravestone was donated by the Professional Tour Guide Association of St. Louis and Bellefontaine. Well, that makes sense because Dred is in Bellefontaine, so they're going to help mark Harriet's grave in Greenwood. Another African-American cemetery, Father Dixon Cemetery. It's in Crestwood, and it is right along a hiking path, and it's got a nice view there. Named after Moses Dixon. He was an abolitionist, co-founder of Lincoln University, now in the headlines here. And who is buried there? Black military veterans, Underground Railroad leaders, formerly enslaved people, and lynching victims. Okay, also buried here, this is Moses Dixon himself. So he is buried there. And this is now on the National Register of Historic Places. So we have this cemetery on the National Register. We also have these other cemeteries on the National Register. And I haven't talked about Coldwater Cemetery, the oldest Protestant cemetery west of the Mississippi. It's still in use. It started in 1809. And who maintains it? It's maintained by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Jefferson Barracks has a giant military cemetery. Purpose and duty defines honor, and this defined them. Basically, death defined them. Here's the entrance. Here's one woman commenting. She's been to many cemeteries, including Arlington. but the size of this cemetery will take your breath away. Miles and miles of white marble headstones as far as the eye can see, and got hills, trees, lawns, a beautiful place. Here's one guy, Navy guy, in World War II in Korea and in Vietnam, served in all three major conflicts. That's impressive. Here's an unknown soldier. That's from the Civil War. Also buried here, Michael Blassie. Michael Blassie, his remains were unidentified, and they were in the Tomb of the Unknowns for Vietnam in Arlington. The Blassie family lived in St. Louis. Here's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for Vietnam. The Blassie family actually visited Washington, D.C., and they went over to Arlington, and they saw this monument. They didn't know a member of their family was inside that tomb. They didn't know he was inside that tomb. And ironically, Michael's sister is in the Air Force, and she's in charge of POW and MIA ceremonies for military families. But finally, of course, DNA testing advanced, and they could figure out that the remains in the tomb were Michael's, and his remains were moved to Jefferson Barracks from the Tomb of the Unknown in Arlington. Also buried here, Richard Gentry. He was interested me because he was a private in the Revolutionary War. You see, he's from Virginia. He saw Cornwallis surrender at Yorktown. And Richard Gentry is buried here in St. Louis. Well, Muslim cemeteries, we have a number of Muslims living here. And when a Muslim gets buried, there's a set ritual. And the body is bathed, it's shrouded in a simple white cloth, nothing pretentious, buried in a grave in the ground, and positioned so the head faces Mecca. The idea is that when the graves are open at the Great Awakening, then the people will head towards Mecca. So the Bosnian Cemetery on South Broadway is a Muslim cemetery. There are the graves lined up. Now, Jewish cemeteries, we have Jewish cemeteries. Now, here is the Muslim system or procedure. 4 things that have to happen: bathing, shrouding, burial, positioning, face Mecca. Jewish burial, no part about where the body should face, but you have to bathe it, shroud in a white cloth, bury it in a grave, actually as quickly as possible, preferably the day after death. And the Jews and Muslims are not exactly friends with each other, but historically they are brethren. They are Semites. These Semites are people who speak a Semitic language. Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages, as well as ancient Phoenician and ancient Canaanite. So they have similar rituals. Mount Sinai is there. That is the Jewish cemetery with wonderful stained glass. Bellefontaine Cemetery, here's the Mourning Society of St. Louis, people who celebrate 19th century mourning, reenact. Bellefontaine's 170 years old. Here's the Bush Mausoleum. It's a tranquil place. Here's the Wainwright Tomb. It's a beloved landmark. Here's the Luites burial plot, the girl behind the glass. Environmental stewardship. This is the Cascade Mausoleum. There it is at the distance. Here it is when you look from the mausoleum. That's this very nicely landscaped cemetery, Bellefontaine. Over 300 events and tours. You can always go on your own. You're welcome to tour there. Who's buried here? William Clark. William Clark was born in Virginia, so his monument faces Virginia. Yes. Well, option. We looked at burials in the ground. We looked at cremation and being put into columbarium, and we looked at being buried in a mausoleum. You now have the option of being buried in a lawn crypt. In a lawn crypt, stacked double-depth concrete vaults, and your grave is not marked, but on a nearby wall will be your name. So here is the situation, what it looks like, drawing a lawn crypt, but you can see in the background, no markers. And here, this is, they call it Wildwood Valley. That's part of Bellefontaine. There you can see along the wall, the names of the people whose crypts are here under this grass. So it just looks like a park. You can also have green burials nowadays, no embalming, no metal, no vault, all biodegradable, buried in a cloth or a wicker basket. Here is an example. This is the wicker basket. That person obviously be buried and then returned to the earth is the idea here. So many choices for burial, so many choices. You can do it, be in a mausoleum. You can get cremated with flames, without flames. You can be put in a columbarium. You can have your cenotaph marking you somewhere, do a lawn crypt, a headstone, a footstone. You can donate your body, QR code on a grave marker. So many choices. But the state of Missouri says you can keep it simple. You can keep it simple. Just go to Walmart. Just go to Walmart and get one of these, a grave digging shovel. Buy your grave digging shovel, and you can bury someone in your backyard. By law, you can bury someone in your backyard. You can see it's statute 214.090, 2018. But you must deed that area where you're burying someone to the county commission and tell them the name of the person you have buried. But it's perfectly legal, perfectly legal. You just get that shovel, bury someone, and contact the county. You have 30 days to tell the county you buried someone in your backyard. If you don't want the hassle of dealing with the county and informing them, if you just want to dig and bury, then just move to Kansas. They don't require anything. All you need is a shovel if you're in Kansas. So this is Cemeteries in St. Louis. I'm Doug Schneider. Coming up for soon to be announced for the prime timers in February, this would be a talk on prisons in Missouri. And that'll be a free Zoom talk the way this one was. And coming up, a visit to the Holocaust Museum. Of course, we all are aware that homosexuals were targets of the Holocaust, and that visit will be on February 22nd. You'll get more details because limited admission. You have to make sure there's tickets available when you go. That's why I put this out as February 22nd. You can buy your ticket in advance and don't have to worry about the event being sold out. Already February 29th, yes, we're having it February 29th this year. That's sold out. February 29th is sold out now. So February 22nd, I'll get you more information, but think about that coming up. So we are here, and I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see that Lee is still with us. Lee, you have watched,
yes, sir.
Watched this presentation. You are on the board for the Taylor Family Cemetery out there in Defiance. What would you like to add to this talk?
Well, let's see, a couple things. While you were talking, I went downstairs and got the family homestead picture of some of the people who were buried there.
Ah.
I don't know whether it shows up or not. dated 1864. It's the Taylor homestead containing Esdras, Lewis, Molly, James, Esther, Charles, and mom and dad, which is Francis, Marion, and Jemima Fridley. And there's a dog in the picture named Fetch, and the horse is named Pet. So if you look closely at this, everybody's kind of in focus, but the horse is kind of moving because he must be having flies on his back or something. So he's kind of blurred. So the homestead was sold to the Taylors by Daniel Boone. They came to Defiance in 1851, and my aunt married Frank Boone. Actually, they lived next door to each other. That's Frank Boone, my uncle, and so he's the son of Nathan. So let's do a little bit of background here. So family farms had their own plot of ground set aside for the deceased. The Taylor Cemetery contains some of these people in the picture, as well as when I took over as an executor of the estate, several people named Washington. And I kept asking, what are they doing? And everybody else is named Taylor. And finally, after years, a cousin finally confided in me that those were the slaves that we had. And they remained on the farm after Emancipation Proclamation. But they were buried there too, which is a kind of unusual. So the family farm and the family cemetery plot was kind of part of the world in the 1800s. So there weren't any funeral homes. So you would be you would rent a kind of an ice coffin from the local furniture store guy who made furniture and cabinetry, and it was a thing that was lined with tin, and you would put ice in it. The family would clean the body and put the body inside this thing, and it had a lid on top of it with a glass window for the face, and that was put in the parlor of your living room. That was your formal living room, which was never used for anything except for social occasions. So you would invite people to come and pay their respects, and then the furniture maker would tailor make a wooden coffin for you, and that was what was the body was buried in. So you mentioned the headstones and the footstones. The reason there were footstones was to mark the layout of where that grave was, because it was a wooden coffin, it would rot eventually and collapse. So oftentimes the grave would simply be indented. And if you walked on it, it would kind of hasten the thing a little bit. So that's the reason whenever I was a kid at church, there were church cemeteries and family cemeteries. So the church cemetery, if you got baptized and you were a member of that church, you were permitted to be buried in the church cemetery. So therefore, you usually had the display of the body at the church. Let's see what else. That furniture maker who made the coffin then got the idea later on that, well, he could take this kind of off the family's hands, and he could create a little space in his business to display the body. So that became a funeral director, and so he also made the coffin and provided that service and got to charge a little bit more money for it. That's kind of it. So that was it. I remember I read Daniel Boone's autobiography, and that the building there in Defiance, which was his son's home, after his wife died, Daniel moved in with them, and he was in his 80s, I believe, when he finally died. But he had his coffin made, and it was stuck up in the attic, waiting for his demise. But he'd go up and practice. Oftentimes in the 1800s, your final death scene was really something the family could talk about for years. So he would go up and lay in that coffin, and he would practice his death scene. It was just weird, fascinating stuff. I love that. One final thing, I'll let you go, is you mentioned about donating your body. So I have my wife and I both have signed up for the National Body Donor Program, NBDP. So it's a different kind of program than Wash U would have. My wife, when she died, was taken care of under the donor program, as will I be. The National Donor Program basically permits you to die anywhere there is roadways and some way to pick you up, because you have to be prepared differently than you would be in common embalming. So you're generally, the body is picked up by, in this case, the St. Louis Cremation Society would picked up my wife and would remove me from the home. And then the body is donated to the medical schools for research. My wife's body, because of her condition and her age, was a particular interest. So it was kept for 2 years. So the first year was in the University of Chicago, and the second year was sent to University of Arizona. They finally notified me that the body was ready to be picked up. The ashes were ready to be picked up. But that was 2 years later. But the interesting thing about the National Body, the body program, is that unlike a university program, you have to be deceased in this city or nearby, because they have to come and get you and take you to school. The National Body Program is nationwide, including Canada. So they'll pick you up no matter where you are and transfer you to a local cremation organization for the body preparation. There's no cost involved at all. So there's zero cost, because your donation to science is the cost. So they will pick you up, and it's a professional group of people. It's not just someone with a pickup truck or something. And so I just want to mention that. So that's enough of my babbling, but enough about death and dying. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lee. I will mention that I used to live in Dallas, Texas, in an apartment building where each apartment actually had a window onto the hallway. And we had a woman in the apartment building who practiced her death scene every day. She had a coffin in her window facing the hallway, and when you walked by, she would be in her coffin. So I guess she's following in Daniel Boone's footsteps. Okay, thank you, Lee. Anyone else want to unmute and ask or say something? Okay, Rich, you have to unmute. Down in your lower left-hand corner, Rich. Unmute. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to state Dred Scott is buried in Calvary Cemetery, not Bellefontaine. But
Okay.
yeah. But did you come across any reason why the great George Sisler would be buried so far away out that first place you mentioned? I mean, he worked at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis City. Why would he be way out there? Did he live out there?
I would think because he was a Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be my guess.
Arguably the greatest right-handed hitter ever to play the game.
Oh, wow.
Arguably, I'll say, but
His right-handed hitter. Isn't
right-handed hitter, yeah.
Aren't almost every baseball player right-handed?
Well, Stan the Man wasn't, but yeah, most are.
Okay, all right. So that he's a big name in the history of baseball here.
Huge, yeah.
Huge. All right. Anyone else? Okay, John.
I just wanted to mention that when I was in grade school, George Sisler came to the school one time, I remember it's some organization, I don't remember exactly what it was. But anyway, he came to the school and he signed his autograph for us.
Oh.
And another thing, when I was at St. Bridget, they had what they called catacombs underneath the church. I guess it was supports or whatever, and there were these big things, and there were some bodies and pieces of some bones and some pieces of tombstones there. Apparently, nobody ever really was sure exactly how it happened, but apparently they closed the cemetery and moved all the bones there some years before. And when a pastor came along, one of the pastors took over the church and found that there were still bones there. He had the Calvary Cemetery come and pick the bones up. And the guy who came there said that when he started working at Calvary, this was some years before, his first assignment was to go with a crew to the church and pick up bones that were there. And he said at that point, it was just filled with bones. So it'd be interesting to find out exactly what happened there.
Yes, it's almost like being an archaeologist
Yes.
and discovering this stuff. Okay, thank you, John. Anyone else? Yes.
John, I've got a
Frank.
question. Do you have the autograph of George Sisler?
Oh, it's John.
I may have it. I'd have to look and see if it's among my some
I hope
stuff.
you have it.
I probably still have it somewhere, so
Yeah.
I'll have to look. Were you wanting the autograph or?
No, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I know I had it for many years, so I probably
Yeah.
have it somewhere in one of my file cabinets.
Okay, Frank has a question. Can you unmute Frank? You got to unmute Frank. Got to go down in the lower left corner. Frank, you have to unmute.
Up there. Is that okay?
Now, yes, now we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, I just wanted to add also, I've taken several out-of-town visitors to Calvary Cemetery to see Tennessee Williams and William Tecumseh Sherman and Charles Eames. And they've always been very happy to see those places.
Oh,
I just wanted to add that.
okay. So yes,
There's
didn't
a lot to
every-
cover.
Yeah,
There's
didn't
a lot
cover
to
every
cover.
famous person, but
But I just thought I would add that in case anyone likes cemetery tours or takes
Yeah.
people to places like that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, John, again.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when Tennessee Williams was going to be buried, I contacted the priest that was in charge of the funeral and
I
asked
knew him.
if I could be involved in it. And so I was involved in the funeral for Tennessee Williams.
Oh, I knew Jerome Wilkerson too.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. And exactly
Small world.
how were you actually involved?
Well, I was a priest back then, so I
Oh.
celebrated the service and
Oh.
read the gospel.
Oh,
Oh,
definitely part of the service. Yes. Okay. Any other comments or questions? All right. This talk, if I recorded it correctly, will be out on YouTube for a while to be shown to other to prime timers that couldn't attend tonight, and also to Amanda Clark of the Missouri History Museum. And I think she's really going to get a kick out of you folks talking after my talk and see your what you were interested, what you wanted to say would be of interest to her. In any event, it's now time to say good night, and you should be able to see a little end button, and wave. And,
Thank you,
Thank you,
Doug, very
Doug.
much.
It was
okay,
Thank you,
very
Doug.
interesting,
night.
Doug.
okay, good night,
Bye.
and goodbye. All right,
Good night.
good night. We go, good night. And
Oh,
let's
I think I'm out. Maybe not.
okay.
Oh, no, I guess I'm not. That's what the hope will be.
All right, I'm gonna